I do have some cleanup questions I wanted to ask you from the last episode that we did. We talked a little bit about exercise selection and how you choose what exercises go where. And I was hoping we could go into a little bit more detail about that. And starting with maybe explaining the difference between a compound lift and a non-compound lift, and how you think about them structure-wise inside of a workout.
Mm-hmm. We don't do things the traditional way, but we have some similarities with traditional training. And the biggest similarity is that we start with the biggest muscles and go down to the smallest muscles. So we don't want to work the triceps before we work a chest press because the triceps are used in that chain of the chest press. And if we do the triceps first, then that's going to be the weak link in the chain, and that'll be the limiting factor instead of the chest. So we will do it that way because it makes a lot of sense to do the order that way. And compound, of course, is just lots of muscles instead of isolation, which would be the opposite of compound. But our main thing is compound, as much compound as we can, starting with the big muscles and working down to the small muscles. And it's really about the chain of muscles that you're working. So for instance, we will do this exercise. We call it leg curl sliders, where you're lying down on the floor on your back with your heels under carpet sliders. Then you push your hips up into the air like a wrestler bridge. So your shoulder blades and your head are still touching, but everything else is in the air. And your heels, of course, are touching on the sliders. And then now you're shuffling back and forth, right, left, with your feet on the floor if you're doing interval training, or we can do it with any of our methods. So like the the motion method that we talked about last time, 7 seconds out, 7 seconds in. So then, for instance, with that method, on the way out, you're going to take 7 seconds to slide your feet out. So your legs are getting straighter as you're sliding your feet out away from your body, but keeping the feet and knees pretty close together. And the hips as high as you can. Now, when the feet slide out, the hips come down a little bit naturally, and there's nothing you can do about that, but you're still always focusing on trying to keep the hips up as much as you can. And then sliding back in with your feet, which is the hard phase of this exercise, and still trying to keep your hips up. So they might rise up a little bit as the feet come in. And doing it that way, you are training your hamstrings primarily, but you're also getting low back. So people always feel it in the hamstrings first. Second, they feel it in the low back because you're doing that wrestler bridge. And so the back has to work really hard to keep your hips up in the air, which is great because it's a functional, safe way to to exercise the low back because you're not doing a deadlift or anything with spinal compression. It's more like isometric than anything. And you're also getting glutes, although they're such a big, strong muscle, it's hard to feel them in this exercise. So they're not going to really ever fatigue or burn. The weak link is probably going to be the hamstrings, which will fail first, but that's kind of the purpose of the exercise. So that's good. It's appropriate in this case. You're also getting calves because the gastroc crosses the knee joint. So it's also a knee flexor. And so it's a chain of muscles, calves, hamstrings, glutes, low back, basically the whole posterior chain that you're training together. It's called a hamstring exercise, but you're also getting those other muscles. Now, the other muscles in the chain probably aren't going to go to failure like the hamstrings will, but they're still getting benefit mostly because of the endurance they're getting out of it because of the time under tension, because there's never any rest for 3 minutes, but also the communication between the muscles. So what you're doing when you're doing with this controlled motion and chain of muscles talking to each other, they have to communicate and cooperate. When they do that, their communication improves, they get along better, and coordination improves. So anytime you're working a chain of muscle, you're also working the nervous system in that chain, where isolation, you don't get that. So if I were to sit down on a hamstring machine that it's got the axle goes through my knee joint. I'm sitting there and I'm doing the leg curls. Well, it's great isolation, and the bodybuilder would want to do that. But if you want functional training, it's a horrible idea because you're not getting good communication with the joints, the proprioceptors in the joints, with the nerves between the muscles, On that seated leg curl, you're only getting hamstrings and calves, but they don't really have to talk to each other because it's guided by that stupid axle that you lined up going through your knee joint, and the machine's doing a lot of the motion for you. So there's no coordination benefit to this. But if you do it like I described with that functional chain that has to coordinate the movement between all these different muscles at the same time that are all talking to each other, now your coordination is improving, and that's the basis of functional training.
Got it. That's a great answer. I think about it in the same way as you described. Like, let's take care of all the central muscles first. That's where the biggest muscles are. You wouldn't want to tire out, like you said, like your tricep before you did a chest press, because that would be now your rate limiter, and now your chest couldn't experience what you needed it to. So that makes a lot of sense as far as program design. And my wife works here out of our home, and she does tissue release for people, and we're very choosy about what we put in our space. But on the walls are all 7 of, I believe it's Thomas Meyer's anatomy trains, to show people like how all of the muscles are connected to each other, how they talk to each other. And you mentioned those, the chains of muscles, and explaining to somebody like, yes, you have shoulder pain, but that doesn't necessarily mean the pain is coming from the shoulder. It could be coming from the opposite hip, could be coming from another place. And this is how all of this is tied together. So I love how you think about it in that way. That it's not just one muscle in isolation. Like we talked about last time, that might be fine for a bodybuilder who wants to build bulk in that particular area. You want to be thinking of everything kind of globally and attached everywhere, because that's the way our bodies think about it.
Bingo. And you want them talking to each other, communication. And the more they talk to each other in a controlled way, the better they get along, the more they learn they need to cooperate with each other. And then when you have good functional strengths after training like that, when you go down and you pick up that box off the floor wrong, you don't throw your back out, because that chain has already talked with each other. They know how to coordinate and get along and complement each other. And so they do you do a weird motion, and the chain says, oh boy, he forgot perfect form again, but we know how to compensate for this and override the back going out.
Yeah, well explained. I like that. And I think you kind of already explained this. I think I know how you're going to answer this question. I'm going to ask it anyway. Core specific training. How do you think about core specific training, like the muscles that are directly in the middle part of our body?
Yeah. Most people think about it as doing abs, but I think about it as a belt that goes all the way around. So in the example of that leg curl, that's a core exercise, because you're getting that low back and you're suspending yourself in the air with your hips, and the core is a bridge in that case, and those muscles are really working. And so they're part of that whole chain and communication. So the back is part of the core. Your sides are part of the core. So like the easiest example would be a side plank. That's core. And then, of course, the abs are too. And there are other things that stability wise, like deeper muscles, like the transverse abdominis, when you're sucking your belly button in, that's core. The obliques, that's core. Heck, I would even consider the psoas as core, even though it's super deep. It's a hip flexor, but it acts on the core. So anything that controls motion between the pelvis and your rib cage is core. Front, back, side, all of that is core. And the reason core is so important is because a strong core will transfer energy efficiently from your lower body to your upper body. So even for a runner, like a marathon runner, the core is vital, because if they have a weak core, then they're not going to be able to transfer energy between their upper body and lower body, because the core isn't a good link of that energy transfer if it's weak. So then the upper body effort that they're using is going to go down to the core and just disappear basically into the air, and it doesn't get to go down to the legs and vice versa. So you have to have that strong core for really good transfer of energy as well when you're talking about functional training.